What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero meets late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night TV history. The tension was palpable from the moment Ford walked onto that stage, and what started as harmless banter quickly spiraled into a full-blown war of words that left audiences stunned and Ford storming off set in a fit of rage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two titans clash in what can only be described as television gold gone horribly wrong. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Harrison Ford made his entrance to thunderous applause. The legendary actor promoting his latest film project seemed relaxed as he settled into the guest chair opposite Jimmy Kimmel. What the audience didn't know was that behind the scenes, tensions had been brewing for hours. Ford's publicist had reportedly expressed concerns about Kimmel's recent track record of ambushing guests with uncomfortable questions, but the show's producers assured them this would be a straightforward promotional interview. Kimmel opened with his trademark grin, but seasoned observers could detect something different in his demeanor tonight. "Harrison Ford, everybody! Han Solo himself is here," Kimmel announced, gesturing dramatically toward his guest. The audience erupted in cheers, but Ford's response was notably restrained. A simple nod and a tight smile. Not the warm reception Kimmel was clearly expecting. "So, Harrison, you've been doing this for what, 45 years now?" Kimmel began, his tone seemingly casual but carrying an undertone that made Ford's eyes narrow slightly. "That's a long time to be in Hollywood. You've seen a lot of changes, haven't you?" Ford leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands clasped together. "I've seen enough," he replied curtly, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had made him famous. There was something in his delivery that suggested he wasn't just talking about the industry's evolution. The first red flag came when Kimmel shifted in his chair, adopting what regulars knew as his gotcha posture. "You know, I've been reading some interesting things about your thoughts on modern Hollywood," Kimmel said, his smile widening in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Particularly your comments about streaming services and the direction of filmmaking today." Ford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I think I've been pretty clear about my positions," he said, his tone growing cooler by the second. The audience, sensing the shift in energy, began to quiet down from their initial excitement. "Oh, you have been clear," Kimmel nodded, reaching for a stack of papers on his desk with theatrical flair. "In fact, you've been very clear about a lot of things lately. Your opinions on everything from CGI to method acting to, well, let's just say you haven't held back." The camera caught Ford's expression changing, his eyes hardening as he realized this wasn't going to be the promotional softball interview he'd been promised. "Jimmy, I'm here to talk about my new film," Ford said, his voice carrying a warning that anyone who'd worked with him over the decades would recognize immediately. But Kimmel wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by Ford's obvious discomfort. "Oh, we'll get to that," he said with a dismissive wave. "But first, I think our audience would be fascinated to hear about some of your more controversial takes on the industry that made you a star." The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the growing tension between the two men. Ford's publicist, watching from the wings, could be seen making urgent hand gestures to the show's producers, but Kimmel was clearly committed to his chosen path. "You see, Harrison," Kimmel continued, his voice taking on a condescending tone, "that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. I find it fascinating when actors who've made millions from this industry suddenly decide to bite the hand that feeds them." Ford's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening as the implications of Kimmel's words sank in. The legendary actor's face, famous for its stoic expressions, began to show cracks of genuine anger. Whatever Kimmel thought he was doing, He had clearly misjudged his guest's tolerance for public humiliation. The next few seconds would prove to be the point of no return, as Ford's legendary temper began to surface for the first time in decades of professional interviews. "Let me stop you right there, Jimmy." Ford's voice cut through the studio like a blade, his famous composure finally cracking. The audience fell completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. "I didn't come here to be lectured by someone who's made a career out of cheap shots and manufactured controversy." Kimmel's eyes lit up with what could only be described as predatory excitement. This was exactly the reaction he'd been fishing for. And now he had Hollywood, royalty on the hook. "Oh, come on, Harrison," he laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can dish it out in interviews, but you can't take a little pushback? That's not the Han Solo I remember." The mention of his most iconic character seemed to strike a nerve that went deeper than anyone expected. Ford leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to that menacing whisper that had intimidated directors and co-stars for decades. "Don't you dare use my work to justify your pathetic attempt at gotcha journalism. You want to talk about biting hands? Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on humiliating people who come here in good faith." The camera operators were having a field day, switching between close-ups of Ford's increasingly agitated expression and Kimmel's smug satisfaction. The live audience sat in stunned silence, many pulling out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming television history. "Good faith?" Kimmel scoffed, shuffling through his papers with exaggerated dramatic flair. "Is that what you call it when you trash the very franchises that made you rich and famous? When you publicly criticize the studios that turned you from a carpenter into a global icon?" Ford's face flushed with anger. Years of pent-up frustration with the media finally finding an outlet. "You don't know what you're talking about, Jimmy. You sit behind this desk making jokes about people's life's work, their passion projects, their art. You've never created anything meaningful in your entire career except controversy." The insult hit its mark. Kimmel's carefully constructed persona began to slip, revealing something darker underneath. "Meaningful?" he shot back, his voice rising. "You want to talk about meaningful? You've spent the last 5 years complaining about Star Wars, Indiana Jones, everything that made you relevant. Without those franchises, you'd still be hammering nails in Hollywood." That was the final straw. Ford stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward with such force that it nearly toppled over. The sudden movement sent a shockwave through the studio, with security guards instinctively taking a step forward from their positions in the wings. "You arrogant little man," Ford growled, towering over Kimmel, who remained seated, though his cocky demeanor was beginning to waver. "You think because you have a microphone and an audience that gives you the right to diminish other people's work? To question their integrity?" Kimmel, realizing he might have pushed too far, but unable to back down now, doubled down on his attack. "I'm just asking the questions that everyone else is thinking, Harrison. Why is it that every actor who reaches a certain age suddenly becomes an expert critic of the industry that made them?" "Because we've earned the right," Ford exploded, his voice echoing through the stunned studio. "We've put in the work. We've taken the risks. We've created the characters that people love. What have you done except tear down better people than yourself?" The confrontation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Kimmel's producers were frantically signaling from the control room, but their host seemed determined to see this through to its bitter conclusion. The tension in the studio was so thick it was almost suffocating, with crew members frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama play out. "You know what your problem is, Harrison," Kimmel said, finally standing to face his guest, eye to eye, though Ford still had several inches on him. "You can't handle the fact that your time is over. The industry has moved on, and you're just a bitter old man clinging to past glory." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ford's eyes narrowed to slits, his entire body tensing as if preparing for physical confrontation. For a terrifying moment, It seemed like the 80-year-old action star might actually lunge across the desk at his tormentor. Instead, Ford's response was even more devastating than violence could have been. "You want to know what bitter looks like, Jimmy?" Ford's voice dropped to a deadly calm that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier outburst. The studio fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of cameras still rolling. "Bitter is a man who's so insecure about his own mediocrity that he has to tear down legends to feel relevant." Kimmel's face went pale, but he was too deep in now to retreat. "Oh, please, spare me the lecture from someone who—" "I'm not finished," Ford cut him off with such authority that Kimmel actually stepped back. "You want to talk about my career being over? Let me tell you something about careers, son. I've been in this business since before you were born. I've worked with Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas. I've created characters that will outlive both of us. What's your legacy going to be? Making celebrities uncomfortable for cheap laughs?" The audience was completely transfixed, witnessing a master class in controlled fury. Ford's decades of experience dealing with difficult directors and hostile press conferences were all coming together in this moment of reckoning. "You sit there every night," Ford continued, his voice gaining momentum like a freight train, "hiding behind your writer's jokes and your producer's safety net, taking shots at people who actually put themselves on the line. Do you know what courage is, Jimmy? It's not ambushing guests who come here to promote their work. It's standing in front of a camera for 40 years and bearing your soul to the world." Kimmel tried to interject, but Ford was relentless now. Years of media frustration, pouring out like a dam had burst. "You want to question my integrity? My commitment to my craft? I've broken bones for my roles. I've worked 18-hour days well into my 70s. I've given everything I had to characters that mean something to people. And you? You've given the world what, exactly?" The host's usual quick wit seemed to have abandoned him completely. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel was being outmatched on his own show, and everyone in the studio could feel the power dynamic shifting in real time. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Ford pressed on, now pacing behind his chair like a caged predator. "You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's lived through 5 decades of Hollywood history. You could have asked about working with the greatest directors of all time, about the evolution of filmmaking, about what it really takes to create something lasting. Instead, you chose to play gotcha games like some TMZ wannabe." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak stammering. "I was just... The audience expects entertainment, not character assassination," Ford shot back. "There's a difference between entertaining people and humiliating them, but clearly that's a distinction you've never learned." The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Crew members were looking at each other nervously, unsure whether they should cut to commercial or let this unprecedented moment continue to unfold. Ford's publicist had given up trying to signal from the wings and was now frantically texting, presumably to crisis management teams. "You want to know what's really pathetic, Jimmy?" Ford's voice took on a tone of devastating finality. "You've had every advantage in this business: primetime slot, unlimited resources, access to the biggest stars in the world. And what have you done with it? You've turned it into a platform for your own insecurities and petty resentments." Kimmel's face was now flushed with anger and embarrassment. The cameras caught every micro-expression as he struggled to regain control of his own show. "Look, Harrison, maybe you should learn the difference between journalism and bullying," Ford interrupted, his words hitting like hammer blows. "Maybe you should understand that the people who come on this show are human beings with dignity, not punching bags for your neuroses." The audience was completely silent now, many looking genuinely uncomfortable as they witnessed their host being systematically dismantled by one of Hollywood's most respected figures. Social media was already exploding with real-time reactions from viewers watching at home, sensing they were witnessing television history. "I've worked with real professionals, Jimmy. People who understand that entertainment doesn't have to come at the expense of basic human decency. Directors who know how to challenge actors without degrading them. Hosts who can be funny without being cruel. Ford paused, letting his words sink in before delivering what would become the most quoted line of the entire confrontation. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Because you've never actually created anything worth defending. The silence that followed was deafening. Kimmel stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as if searching for words that simply weren't there. The career talk show host, famous for his quick comebacks and sharp wit, had been completely neutralized by Hollywood royalty. But Ford wasn't done yet. The legendary actor was building towards something that would make everything that came before seem like mere preparation. You know what the saddest part of all this is, Jimmy? Ford's voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the studio. I actually used to respect what late-night television could be. Carson, Letterman, even Conan. They understood that their job was to make their guests shine, not to tear them down for ratings. Kimmel tried once more to regain control, his voice shaky and desperate. Harrison, I think we're getting a little off track here. Maybe we should— Off track? Ford's laugh was cold and humorless. No, Jimmy, I think we're finally on the right track. For the first time tonight, we're having an honest conversation. The question is whether you can handle honesty. The studio audience was captivated by this raw display of authentic emotion. Many were recording on their phones, instinctively, knowing they were witnessing a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Let me tell you something about the people you mock and belittle on this show, Ford continued, his voice rising with renewed passion. They're artists, craftspeople, storytellers who've dedicated their lives to bringing joy to millions of people. They've sacrificed their privacy, their personal relationships, sometimes their health, all in service of their art. And you treat them like court jesters here for your amusement. Ford turned to address the audience directly, his commanding presence filling the entire studio. You folks deserve better than this. You deserve hosts who celebrate talent instead of exploiting it. You deserve entertainment that lifts people up instead of tearing them down. The audience began to murmur among themselves, some nodding in agreement. The shift in the room was palpable. What had started as Kimmel's ambush had completely backfired, with the audience's sympathy now squarely behind Ford. I've been in this business for almost 50 years, Ford said, turning back to face Kimmel, who looked increasingly small behind his desk. I've seen the best and worst of Hollywood. I've worked with genuine professionals who understood that with great platform comes great responsibility. And then there are people like you who mistake cynicism for sophistication and cruelty for comedy. Kimmel's producers were frantically gesturing from the control room, but their host seemed paralyzed, unable to find a way out of the hole he'd dug for himself. The confident, quick-witted performer who had controlled this stage for years was nowhere to be found. You asked me about my legacy earlier, Ford said, his voice taking on a tone of finality. My legacy is characters that have inspired generations, stories that have brought families together, movies that people watch when they need hope, adventure, or just a good laugh. What's your legacy going to be, Jimmy? What are people going to remember about Jimmy Kimmel in 20 years? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Kimmel opened his mouth, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his career, he had been rendered completely speechless on his own show. Ford picked up his jacket from the back of his chair with deliberate slowness, every movement calculated for maximum impact. I came here tonight to talk about my new film, to share stories that might entertain your audience, to be a good guest on your show. Instead, you turned it into an opportunity to feed your own ego at my expense. The actor began walking toward the edge of the stage, but stopped and turned back one final time. You know what the difference is between a true professional and a hack, Jimmy? A professional knows when to stop. A hack keeps pushing until they destroy everything around them. Ford's final words were delivered with the quiet intensity that had made him one of cinema's most compelling actors. "I've spent my career working with people who understand that respect is earned through talent, hard work, and treating others with dignity. You might want to think about what you're earning with performances like tonight's." The silence in the studio was absolute as Ford made his way to the exit. Not a single person moved or spoke as Hollywood royalty walked out with his dignity intact, leaving behind a host whose credibility lay in ruins on the studio floor. As the heavy studio door closed behind Ford with a resounding thud, Kimmel was left standing alone at his desk, facing an audience that was looking at him with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of his public humiliation. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Social media exploded with clips of Ford's devastating takedown, with hashtags supporting the actor trending worldwide within hours. Critics praised Ford's eloquent defense of professional dignity, while condemning Kimmel's ambush tactics. The incident sparked widespread discussion about the ethics of late-night television and the responsibility of hosts to their guests. Ratings for Kimmel's show plummeted in the following weeks, as viewers abandoned a host they now saw as a bully rather than an entertainer. The confrontation had revealed something ugly beneath the carefully crafted persona, and audiences weren't interested in supporting it anymore. Harrison Ford had walked into that studio as a guest promoting his latest project. He walked out as the man who had single-handedly exposed the worst impulses of modern television and emerged victorious in one of the most lopsided confrontations in late-night history. It was a masterclass in dignity, professionalism, and the power of standing up to bullies, even when the cameras are rolling.